don't read history, read biographies, for they are life without theory. Some books, even if written about economics or finance, become mirrors reflecting the destiny of an entire civilization. Lords of Finance * by Liaquat Ahamed is one such book. An academic work that reconstructs the moment humanity entered the seismic event known as the Great Depression, seen through the lens of 4 individuals. Central bankers who held the world's fate in their hands, from Montagu Norman in Britain, Benjamin Strong in America, Hjalmar Schacht in Germany, to Émile Moreau in France. They were once called the most exclusive club in the world, and it was their decisions that pushed the entire system into the abyss. The book opens with the image of a giant central bank governor collapsing from stress amidst a trembling global financial system. Page by page, it then leads us into the backstage secrets: the negotiations over the gold standard, war reparations, hyperinflation, and the naive arrogance of an era that believed it had forever escaped tragedy. So, the question is, could history have taken a different path if those holding the keys to the world's treasuries had had the courage to break free from the shackles of dogma? And looking back at the present, are we repeating the familiar spirals our ancestors once experienced? Let's now begin our summary of this book. Part 1: The Unexpected Storm. An era thought to be invincible closed in August 1914. For the 4 decades prior, the gold standard had been the bedrock of the global financial system. London sat at its center, like a heart pumping blood to the entire world. Capital flowed freely from Europe to India, from colonial ports in Africa to corn farms in America, from the high plateaus of the Amazon to the coal and steel mines of the Ruhr region. Not only did commodity trade boom, but also colossal infrastructure projects. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway, the Suez Canal, and the Panama Canal were all nourished by these capital flows. People believed that war among European powers was impossible. The reasoning seemed solid. With interdependent economies, an all-out conflict would ruin everything. This belief was further amplified by Norman Angel's The Great Illusion *. He argued that economic interests had bound nations so tightly that if war broke out, the victor would suffer as much as the vanquished. Translated, the book sold over 1 million copies, spread across 22 languages, and became a handbook for many politicians, journalists, and even rulers from Washington to Paris, from Berlin to Vienna. The elite reiterated this point as an obvious truth. Lord Esher, a figure close to the British royal family, even declared that new economic factors rendered war meaningless. They believed the age of conquest by sword was over, replaced by an era of credit, trade, and profit. Yet, just weeks after the shots rang out in Sarajevo, all that faith collapsed. The international financial system, once lauded as a symbol of order and reason, suddenly became fragile. In the last days of July 1914, the stock markets of Berlin, Vienna, Budapest, Brussels, St. Petersburg, and Pittsburgh closed one after another. Only Paris remained open, but it too trembled before the gathering storm. Investors panicked, withdrew capital, and fled to the only place that still held its promise: gold in London. The scene outside the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street was unprecedented in modern history. A long queue of people waited to exchange banknotes for gold. Among them, many women clutched £5 notes, their eyes filled with anxiety. It wasn't exactly chaos, but the air was heavy with anticipation. The iron gates of the bank opened, allowing small groups into the courtyard. Opposite, on the steps of the Royal Exchange, another crowd gathered, watching and whispering. The *Times* newspaper wrote that there was no scene of disorder, just anxiety seeping into every face. As a precaution, the porters, dressed in their traditional pink tailcoats and top hats the bank's traditional uniform, had been sworn in as special constables, with powers of arrest should the situation spiral out of control. But fear was not easily dispelled. The Bank of England's gold reserves plummeted from $130 million to under $50 million in just 3 days. Finally, to stem the gold outflow, the bank was forced to raise interest rates to an unprecedented 10%. What transpired proved a paradox. The system people believed to be absolutely safe was precisely its most vulnerable point. A single spark from the Bank of England was enough to bring down the seemingly indestructible structure. Before the crisis, many still reassured themselves with the image of London, the financial fortress. Yet, in just a few days, that faith melted away. International credit transactions, which had sustained countless companies, banks, and even governments, immediately broke down. From loan contracts for China, Denmark, and Brazil, to even those for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all hung in limbo, impossible to execute. A financial paralysis gripped Europe. Across the ocean, the United States initially stood aside, but the collapse of the old continent unexpectedly opened an opportunity for New York from the sidelines. It began to emerge as a new financial hub, with capital flowing into Manhattan. And within a few years, the dollar gradually gained a competitive position against the pound sterling. The financial storm of 1914 not only shook the banking system, but also exposed a truth. The belief that economics would prevent war was merely an illusion. On the contrary, when war came, economic tools, gold, credit, banks transformed into weapons. In the last days of July, amidst the tumultuous London market, the name Montagu Norman was still relatively unknown to the public. At the time, he was just one of the partners at Brown Shipley, an old commercial bank. But it was the financial storm of 1914 that propelled Norman into a position that would later command the world's attention. Montagu Norman, born in 1871, grew up in a prestigious banking family, but he never felt he belonged to that preordained world. From a young age, Norman was sickly, suffering from severe headaches and prone to bouts of gloom. At Eton, where his family expected him to shine like his father and grandfather, glorious cricket captains, Norman felt lost and solitary, not good at sports, nor particularly popular. He dropped out of Cambridge after just 1 year, feeling unable to fit in. After several years of wandering through Europe, Norman returned to banking. But his early career was fraught with difficulties. He had no interest in the tedious work at Martin's Bank and then tried Brown Shipley, where he spent nearly 2 decades in a state of conflict and insecurity. As his relationships with partners grew increasingly strained, he decided to withdraw his capital from the firm, just as Europe was on the verge of war. In July 1914, when Sarajevo was shaken by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Norman was still in Gloucestershire. He only returned to London when the market was already reeling. Commercial banks withdrew gold from the Bank of England, causing reserves to plummet. In 3 days, the gold reserves dropped from $130 million to under $50 million. To prevent a crisis, the Bank of England was forced to raise interest rates to an unprecedented 10%. London, once the global credit hub where hundreds of millions of dollars in deals were struck annually from loans for China, Denmark, and Brazil, to bond contracts for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all passed through the hands of bankers on Threadneedle Street. When war flared, this entire network disintegrated in just days. Old established banks trembled on the brink of collapse. Amidst the chaos, the British government was forced to extend the bank holiday. Commercial debts were extended for another month. The Bank of England, with the Treasury's backing, stepped in to rescue commercial banks, untangling the intricate web of debts at emergency meetings. Shouts, even fists aimed directly at the governor, occurred, demonstrating that even seasoned financiers lost their composure before the abyss. Norman, then just a director of the Bank of England, stood at the epicenter. Remarkably, instead of crumbling under pressure, he felt his body and spirit liberated. "I have worked day and night and never felt so well," he wrote to a friend. For someone tormented by depression his entire life, this paradox was strange. The crisis itself brought him a sense of balance outside of work. Norman led a life quite different from the image of a banker. He lived alone at Thorpeness, a 2-story house with 7 servants. He designed the interior himself, featuring an arts and crafts style, with precious African and Latin American woods covering the walls. The domed music room, where Brahms and Schubert symphonies often resonated, was his sanctuary. But beneath that luxurious facade was a contradictory man, capable of being charming and lively. Yet when plunged into gloom, he became irritable, silent, and withdrew from the world. Before the war, Norman had suffered a severe mental breakdown, seeking help from Dr. Roger Vitaz in Zurich, who used a method of focused meditation to help him recover. From there, Norman embarked on a strange journey, pursuing theosophy, practicing positive autosuggestion, and even delving into spiritualism. These pursuits led many to consider him a dangerous eccentric. But it was this eccentricity, combined with his extraordinary stress tolerance, that prepared him for an unusual role. The man who would lead the Bank of England through the century's most tumultuous years. When the opening shots rang out, London faced its worst banking crisis in history. And in the thick darkness of the war's early days, Norman's figure began to emerge as a force that would shape the destiny of global finance. In Berlin, the summer of 1914 seemed serene. Emperor Wilhelm II was still cruising on his yacht Hohenzollern in the Norwegian fjords. Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg had returned to his vast estate in Hohenfinau. General von Moltke was still at Carlsbad drinking mineral water. Even the foreign minister was enjoying his honeymoon. On the surface, the German Empire appeared unconcerned, but behind this peaceful facade were subtle signals. Leading banks, intimately connected with the court, had heard whispers that something was about to happen. Walther Rathenau, one of those closely linked to the emperor, expressed pessimism as early as July. Rumors even spread that the crown prince himself had confided to his banker friends that Berlin was about to face war. Within that maelstrom was a young man, just 36 years old, whose name seemed almost foreign to Germany, Hjalmar Schacht. He wasn't yet a star, merely a branch manager at Dresdner Bank, one of Germany's two largest banks. But in the lower echelons of Berlin's financial circles, Schacht had already attracted attention with his disciplined demeanor and sharp intellect. His appearance perfectly reflected Prussian discipline: a short-trimmed mustache, neatly parted hair, and a stiff, starched collar that gave him the rigid gait of an officer. Yet, he was not from nobility or the military. His family belonged to the lower middle class, originating from Schleswig-Holstein, a harsh, windswept region that had once belonged to Denmark before falling into Prussian hands after the war. His father struggled his entire life, working as a teacher, journalist, soap factory manager, and insurance agent. Failure after failure left his father perpetually struggling. This very helplessness instilled in Hjalmar Schacht a defiant will, an ambition to rise at all costs. Schacht grew up in Hamburg, the empire's most international port city. There he absorbed the spirit of global commerce, learned languages, and accessed a broader world. His shrewdness and decisiveness helped him quickly rise in banking circles despite lacking family connections. In early 1914, Schacht was involved in a loan deal for the city of Budapest, which caught the attention of European financiers. Yet, just as he was establishing his position, the storm of war broke out. Berlin plunged into chaos as news of general mobilization spread. Exchanges closed, stocks froze, and the international credit system, the empire's lifeline, was immediately severed. Germany, already capital-starved, was now suffocated. Gold was seized by the state. All financial flows had to submit to the sole objective of fueling the war machine. In this context, Schacht observed from his position as a young banker. He realized the paradox: Germany's proud economic miracle could vanish in just a few days. With its ties to the international system severed, Hjalmar Schacht was heavily affected in 1914, witnessing firsthand the fragility of finance when tightly bound by politics. That lesson would stay with him throughout his later career, as he rose to become the governor of Germany's central bank. In that stormy summer, both London and Berlin recognized the same truth. The global system, dependent on gold and credit, could collapse in the blink of an eye. For individuals like Schacht, this event was not just an incident, but a wake-up call for an entire generation. Across the Atlantic, another figure gradually stepped onto the stage: Benjamin Strong, born in 1872 in Yorkville, New York. His career began not in luxurious boardrooms, but from mundane jobs in law offices and insurance companies. His diligence, computational ability, and intuition for financial risk led him to banking. By age 30, Strong became one of the most promising figures at Bankers Trust, a new but ambitious institution where he quickly rose to president. Strong embodied a unique blend: an energetic exterior, a tough personality, but an inner world filled with personal wounds. He was widowed early, raising 4 young children alone. Tuberculosis plagued him, leaving him in a precarious state of health. Yet this very fragility made Strong even more determined in his work, as if he knew his time was limited and he had to seize every opportunity. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was born, marking a turning point. For the first time, America had a true central bank. Strong became the governor of the New York Fed, its most powerful branch, not just due to its size, but because of New York's position as the world's burgeoning financial center. When war erupted in Europe, the U.S. initially maintained neutrality. But this very neutrality transformed the nation across the ocean into a lifeline for Europe's beleaguered economies. As banks in London, Paris, and Berlin struggled due to the war, Wall Street came alive. International capital redirected, gold flowed into New York's vaults. In a short time, the balance of power began to shift. Strong recognized the opportunity, and with the eye of an organizer, he saw not only the gold flow, but also a change in the global financial balance. Previously, London was the sole monetary capital, but now, New York could rise to its level. From a debtor nation, America became a creditor. Strong demonstrated a different management style. While his European counterparts were bound by tradition, he was more open, ready to experiment. He built a direct communication network with other central banks, establishing a personal relationship with Montagu Norman, a friendship, and a crucial collaboration in the decade that followed. Yet, in 1914, all this was just the beginning. The United States had not yet entered the war, but was already reaping enormous benefits from the chaos in Europe. It was in this moment that the nascent dollar became a rival to the pound sterling, a seemingly small change that would shape an entire century. Benjamin Strong, with his fragile health and far-sighted vision, became the face of a new America. Young, energetic, and quietly replacing Europe as the world's financial center. Among the four figures whose stories are interwoven in this narrative, the representative for France was Émile Moreau. If Montagu Norman was eccentric, Schacht ambitious and cold, and Benjamin Strong powerful yet fragile, then Moreau appeared as a quintessential French civil servant. Cautious, reserved, and even skeptical of anything that came from beyond the borders. Moreau was born and raised in a society where France still bore the deep wounds of the 1870 war with Prussia. The memory of the fall of Napoleon's empire and the humiliation of losing Alsace-Lorraine became a collective obsession for an entire generation. Moreau, as a financial official, absorbed that spirit. France had to rely on itself, gold had to be hoarded, and the economy had to be cautious. In 1914, when the shots rang out, Paris faced not only a military enemy, but also unprecedented financial pressure. Its bank, already fragile after years of depletion from war and reconstruction, now had to bear an immense additional burden. Like Britain, France was forced to control gold, restrict withdrawals, and rely on international loans to sustain its war machine. But unlike London and New York, where banking systems could mobilize enormous capital from the market, Paris was constrained by the constant worry that its reserves could run dry at any moment. Moreau, with his conservative nature, trusted gold almost absolutely as the foundation of all value. He viewed the world with suspicion. Allies, including Britain and America, could become rivals when interests clashed. This reflected a deep-seated mentality in French society at the time: introverted, reserved, prioritizing safety over adventure. But even though each character possessed distinct nuances, they were all caught in the same maelstrom of 1914. As war spread, the global financial system, founded on the gold standard, collapsed in mere weeks. There was no longer free cross-border credit flow. No longer the trust that gold would move freely. Every nation, whether great power or small, closed its financial borders, clinging desperately to its fragile reserves. The so-called golden age of financial globalization, where London banks could finance railways in Argentina, ports in India, factories in Russia, ended in a shock. What Norman Angell had believed in the Great Illusion turned out to be merely a mirage. Instead of preventing war, finance and trade were choked by it, transformed into instruments of destruction. And here we see four figures gradually emerging from the shadows. Norman, the peculiar man with a troubled soul who would become the most powerful face of the Bank of England. Hjalmar Schacht, ambitious and cold, observing from Berlin with the gaze of one determined to rise. Benjamin Strong, laying the groundwork for America's new role, where the dollar began to compete with the pound sterling. And Émile Moreau, the embodiment of caution and suspicion, reflecting a France still haunted by its past. Four individuals, four nations, four personalities all stepping onto a stage just opened by the unexpected storm of 1914. From here, their destinies would become intertwined with that of the world. In the years to come, they would become the lords of finance, men who seemingly held the keys to economic order. But it would also be them, with their decisions and mistaken beliefs, who would push the world into the abyss of the century's deepest economic crisis. Part 2. After the Deluge. After the guns fell silent on the front, Europe emerged from the war utterly depleted, ruined cities, exhausted industries, and a shattered monetary system. The mark, franc, lira, krona currency values fluctuated wildly. The former faith in the stability of the gold standard was now just a memory. In that void, the question that haunted the entire political and financial establishment was, who would pay the price for this unprecedented slaughter? The answer came quickly: German reparations. For many victorious leaders, especially in Paris and London, this idea was self-evident. Germany had caused the war, Germany must pay. But at what level, by what means, and with what consequences? That was the labyrinth that led to the tragedy at Versailles in 1919. The prolonged negotiations were not just about territorial division, but also about settling accounts. Georges Clemenceau of France wanted to bleed Germany dry, seeing it as the only way to prevent their age-old enemy from recovering. Britain was more hesitant. On one hand, it wanted to curb Germany, but on the other, it needed markets and stability to maintain international capital flows. The U.S. under Woodrow Wilson initially opposed excessive demands, but ultimately yielded to Allied pressure. The result was a contradictory document. Germany was forced to bear colossal reparations amounting to hundreds of billions of gold marks, a figure far beyond its actual capacity. Those who designed this mechanism cared little for economic feasibility. They were obsessed with politics and revenge. The German public reacted fiercely. In Berlin, Versailles was not a peace treaty, but a treaty of humiliation. The newly formed Weimar government faced an unbearable financial burden as payment deadlines approached. They were forced to borrow, print money, and sacrifice domestic stability. The mark rapidly depreciated, paving the way for the hyperinflationary spiral of the years that followed. But it wasn't just the German economy that was shaken. Other central banks in London, Paris, and New York also found themselves trapped. Norman, Hjalmar Schacht, Moreau, the central figures of this story all observed these developments with a mixture of anxiety and helplessness. They understood that the international financial system could only recover if capital flows resumed. But how could that happen when a major economy like Germany was suffocated? Reparations were not just a financial obligation, they were a ticking time bomb. Each payment deadline brought new tension, pushing Europe into a spiral of instability. The initial idea that reparations would force Germany into submission proved to have the opposite effect. It sowed resentment, weakened the fledgling democracy in Berlin, and ignited the seeds of broader political instability. The reparations threw the entire international system out of balance. France and Britain waited for money from Berlin to repay their debts to Washington. But when Germany couldn't pay, the domino chain spread across Europe, then bounced over to America. A financial structure based on fragile promises began to form, plausible on the surface, but hollow within. Behind the numbers and documents lay a cruel paradox. Those who designed the reparations believed they were building lasting peace, but in reality, they were laying the groundwork for perpetual instability in Berlin. The atmosphere after Versailles was suffocating, like a prison with no exit. Every line in the treaty felt like a stab, not only loss of territory and military reductions, but also a burden of reparations beyond all imagination. While French politicians called it justice, the German people saw it as a humiliation. Berlin newspapers repeatedly used the phrase "treaty of shame," turning it into a slogan of defiant unity. The Weimar government was flustered from the start. They understood their economy couldn't possibly pay. To meet the initial deadlines, they were forced to borrow, print more money, and sacrifice domestic stability. The consequences quickly appeared. The mark depreciated, prices soared. People held their monthly wages in their hands, but the price of bread, coal, and milk had doubled in just a few weeks. In financial circles, some still believed that if properly structured, Germany could manage. But the reality was that the figures set were not based on economic capacity, but on hatred and political pressure. Some economists warned that forcing Germany to pay huge sums would not bring security to Europe, but only sow greater instability. But these voices were drowned out in the atmosphere of vengeance. In France, Émile Moreau and financial circles strongly supported collecting reparations. For them, this was not only justice, but also the only way to rebuild the country after its ravaged fields and towns reduced to rubble. France needed capital, and Germany had to provide it. In Britain, the division was clearer. Some statesmen and banking experts understood that if Germany collapsed, all of Europe would follow. But the British public, having suffered heavy losses in the war, would not easily accept an enemy escaping punishment. Norman, observing from the Bank of England, clearly understood that the international financial system could not function if a key economy like Germany was imprisoned in debt. He feared prolonged tension would destroy the capital bridge between Berlin and London. From New York, Benjamin Strong also watched the situation cautiously. He realized that if Germany was strangled, the pressure would ultimately fall on America, a nation slowly becoming a global creditor, but without a strong political voice. Yet, his intuition told him that a financial structure built on unfeasible reparations could not be sustainable. Meanwhile, Hjalmar Schacht, though not yet a central figure, witnessed Germany's desperation from within. He recognized the vicious cycle. To pay reparations, one had to borrow. Borrowing led to currency devaluation, and devaluation made it even harder to pay. A self-destructive structure was being built, and he, in the future, would seek to dismantle it. Every reparations deadline became a political event. Each time it approached, the press was filled with fear. Can Berlin pay? If not, what will happen? How will Paris react? Will London intervene? Will Washington force its allies to keep their promises? The entire continent hung by a slender thread. The bitter paradox lay in this. Reparations were designed to create long-term security, but in reality, they sowed new instability. Politicians believed they were consolidating peace, but they were actually placing an invaluable propaganda weapon into the hands of extremists, the outrage of a humiliated people. While the German reparations saga was still unfolding, another issue emerged: war debts. Throughout 4 bloody years, Britain and France had borrowed enormous sums from the US to sustain the war. Now the war was over, but those debts couldn't simply disappear. The question was, would America demand full repayment, or would it forgive a portion to help rebuild Europe? In 1922, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a memorandum to Washington, later known as the Balfour Note. In it, London argued that if France and Britain were to repay their debts to the US, they could only do so if they received adequate reparations from Germany. Conversely, if Washington canceled or reduced the debts, Berlin's burden could be eased, and all of Europe would have a chance to recover. Balfour wanted to frame the issue as a balanced cycle. Reparations and war debts had to be treated as a single entity. The reaction from the American side was furious. The public, already fed up with European entanglements, now grew even more resentful at the suggestion of debt cancellation. Congressmen, newspapers, and even veterans' organizations unanimously protested. Why should we forgive those who dragged us into war? Why should the hard-earned money of American taxpayers carry Europe? The press clamored that Europe wanted to freeload, and that Balfour was simply trying to shirk responsibility. To quell the debate, the U.S. Congress established the World War Debt Commission, headed by Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. The committee's principle was clear: America would not cancel debts, and the minimum for negotiation was 90 cents on the dollar. This meant allies could receive extended payment terms and lower interest rates, but would still have to repay almost in full. European capitals were shaken. In Paris, people were outraged. In London, the government sought compromise, but public opinion was also inflamed. French and British newspapers spared no words in criticizing America's hardline stance. The epithet Uncle Shylock began to circulate, comparing the U.S. to the notorious moneylender in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice ***. The Economist ** even published a letter signed Portia, borrowing the words of the play's female character to satirize Washington's harsh attitude. In America, public reaction was the complete opposite. They viewed the nickname as an insult. Public opinion increasingly favored a tough stance. Lawmakers emphasized that the blood and sacrifice of American soldiers could not be traded for empty promises from Europe. Debt recovery became a symbol of national pride. This confrontation exposed a truth: the two sides of the Atlantic no longer shared the same perspective. For Europe, war debts were intrinsically linked to German reparations. If Berlin didn't pay, London and Paris couldn't pay Washington. For the US, these were simply contracts that had to be enforced. A cold legalistic view clashed directly with political necessity and economic reality. The consequence was a vicious cycle. Germany had to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used that money to pay the US, but if Germany couldn't pay, the entire chain would break. The Balfour Note and the subsequent reactions only tightened the knot. In the eyes of many observers, war debts had become a dangerous game. No one wanted to concede, but everyone understood that if it dragged on, the entire system would collapse, and the Uncle Shylock epithet became a bitter symbol of the fracture within the once Allied bloc. Amidst the tense atmosphere over war debts, London tentatively entered direct negotiations with Washington. The British government's objective was clear: to find an honorable way to repay its debts without ruining its economy, while also preserving London's position as a global financial center. The task of leading the delegation fell to Stanley Baldwin, then Prime Minister. Baldwin was not a charismatic politician, but was seen as the embodiment of calm pragmatism. He believed that to maintain Britain's international credibility, an agreement with the US was unavoidable. If London evaded, the international credit system would collapse, and the pound sterling itself would bear the consequences. Baldwin arrived in Washington in the winter of 1923. The trip was closely watched from both sides of the Atlantic. The American public waited to see if London would yield, while the British public was anxious, fearing their prime minister would be humiliated. Behind the scenes, a figure less publicly noticed but decisively influential was Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, with his increasingly deep relationships with his New York counterparts. Serving as a strategic advisor to Baldwin, Norman understood that to maintain market confidence, Britain had to demonstrate its willingness to repay its debts. He also understood that this agreement was not just a financial matter, but also a political signal. London was acknowledging that it now had to share financial power with New York. On the other side of the negotiating table was Andrew Mellon, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, one of the wealthiest men in Harding's cabinet. Mellon, from the steel and banking industries of Pittsburgh, exuded the demeanor of a true capitalist, cold, calculating, and not easily swayed by emotional appeals. For Mellon, the issue was simple: loan contracts had to be repaid, and America had no obligation to shoulder the burden of European reconstruction. The meetings were serious. Baldwin, with his deep voice, continually emphasized the friendship and sacrifices Britain had made in the war. He argued that if Britain were forced to repay its debts in full while still not receiving adequate reparations from Germany, its economy would be stifled, and the consequences would ultimately rebound on the U.S. Norman, from behind the scenes, supplemented with sharp analyses of the risk of instability in the international financial system. Mellon held firm. He reiterated the War Debt Commission's 90 cents on the dollar principle. However, to show some concession, he agreed to extend the repayment period and lower interest rates. The final agreement stipulated that Britain would repay its entire debt over 62 years at an average interest rate of 3.3%. When Baldwin returned to London, he declared before the House of Commons that this was an honorable agreement. However, public opinion at home reacted coldly, even with anger. Many felt the Prime Minister had conceded too much, but Baldwin and Norman knew that the alternative was worse. Refusing to pay would mean the pound sterling would lose credibility, and London's position as the global financial center would shift to New York even faster. In Washington, public opinion welcomed the agreement with pride. The press lauded America for demonstrating its strength. Even the empire that once dominated the world had to accept debt repayment. The Uncle Shylock image was now replaced by another symbol: America as the supreme creditor, forcing even its closest allies to submit. Nevertheless, behind the signings and speeches, the agreement only addressed the symptom. The root cause, the link between war debts and German reparations, remained intact. If Berlin didn't pay, Paris and London would struggle to pay on time. And so, the chain of instability continued, like an underground river eroding the foundations of the entire global financial system. While Europe grappled with German reparations and war debts, another quieter but more decisive question still hung in the air. Should the world return to the pre-war gold standard? The gold standard was considered the most solid foundation of the global financial system. It ensured that paper money could always be converted into gold at a fixed rate, fostering confidence for investors and international trade. This mechanism had made London the #1 financial center. But when war broke out, all nations temporarily suspended gold convertibility, printing more money to fuel their military machines. By 1918, the entire system had collapsed. Nevertheless, the political and psychological appeal of the gold standard remained strong. For many leaders, returning to the gold standard meant restoring order, credibility, and discipline. It was a symbol of a return to a civilized world after chaos. Therefore, despite the harsh reality, they clung to this idea. The problem was that in the post-war context, the gold standard became a straitjacket. To maintain fixed exchange rates, each nation had to sacrifice its ability to stimulate domestic economic recovery. Budget deficits could not be offset by printing money. Unemployment and recession had to be accepted instead of easing policies. Returning to the gold standard was like forcing a sick body into a suddenly tight suit that once fit perfectly. In France, Émile Moreau trusted gold almost absolutely. He believed only gold guaranteed true value, and everything else was an illusion. In Britain, Montagu Norman was also captivated by the allure of the gold standard. For him, it was not just a monetary mechanism, but also the belief that the pound sterling would retain its world leadership position. In America, Benjamin Strong was more cautious, recognizing its limitations, but not daring to openly oppose the traditionalist wave. The most prominent opponent, however, came from economists. John Maynard Keynes called the gold standard a barbarous relic, a vestige of a bygone era now only causing harm. He argued that instead of forcing the economy into a gold framework, nations needed flexibility, the ability to adjust monetary policy to restore production and employment. But these voices remained a minority, not powerful enough to sway the views of politicians and central bankers. The paradox here was that while the world was immersed in instability due to reparations and war debts, instead of seeking innovative solutions, leaders reverted to an outdated symbol. They thought the gold standard would bring stability, but in reality, it only tightened the vice. Post-war Europe found no exit, only building walls of debt and monetary shackles. Germany was crushed under the burden of reparations. France and Britain were trapped in debt to the US, and the entire system was tightly bound to an unsuitable gold standard. It was a fragile structure, beautiful on paper, but cracking from within. Part 3: Sowing New Winds. In 1923, Germany plunged into an unprecedented catastrophe in modern history. The mark, once a symbol of Prussian industrial might and financial discipline, now vanished into smoke. The currency's value plummeted freely, forcing people to carry wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Within months, inflation reached a level where all conventional economic standards became meaningless. The initial event was the Weimar government's decision to halt reparations payments, protesting the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr. To resist, Berlin called for workers to strike, and lacking budgetary support, they could only print more money to cover expenses. The self-destructive spiral began there. As production fell, the state printed more, and as prices doubled weekly, people lost all faith in the mark. The scenes on the streets of Berlin, Cologne, or Frankfurt at the time were vivid illustrations of an economy's collapse. People exchanged labor for goods directly in black markets because paper money became worthless. Children played with stacks of money like scrap paper. Workers received wages in the morning and rushed to buy food before prices doubled again by evening. The middle class, once the backbone of German urban society, had their assets wiped out in mere weeks. But hyperinflation was not just an economic disaster, it was a social and political earthquake. An entire generation felt betrayed. They had saved their whole lives, but in the blink of an eye, everything turned to ashes. This sense of loss sowed distrust in the fledgling democracy. Extremist forces began to gain ground, exploiting the public's resentment. In this context, Hjalmar Schacht stepped into a pivotal role. Appointed currency commissioner, he faced a seemingly impossible task, restoring faith in the currency. The solution presented was the issuance of a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed not by gold but by land and industrial assets. This didn't immediately erase hyperinflation, but at least it signaled that a bridge was being built from chaos to hope. This change didn't come from magic, but from discipline and confidence. When the government declared an end to reckless mark printing and introduced the Rentenmark at a fixed exchange rate, the market began to accept it. Prices stopped spiraling, and trade slowly recovered. In cities, people stopped carrying sacks of money to the market, instead using the new, more stable currency notes. But this bridge was fragile. The system still depended on international capital flows and the ability to restructure Germany's reparations obligations. No nation could stand alone in such a state. Berlin needed a broader agreement, requiring international community intervention. Meanwhile, in London and Paris, central bankers observed closely. Montagu Norman understood that if Germany slid deeper into chaos, the entire European credit system would disintegrate. Émile Moreau remained skeptical, fearing that all aid would be futile if Berlin didn't truly change. In New York, Benjamin Strong watched with a pragmatic eye. He saw an opportunity for the U.S. to intervene more deeply, reshaping transatlantic capital flows. 1923 became a turning point. It not only exposed the fragility of the German economy, but also proved that in a world interconnected by debt and credit, a crisis in one nation could become a global problem. From the ashes of hyperinflation, the idea of a new solution, an international agreement, began to emerge. And it was there that the story of the Dawes Plan would be born, opening the next chapter in the struggle to keep the system afloat. After the Rentenmark was put into circulation in late 1923 and stability was created, the core problem remained. How could Germany truly afford the reparations imposed by Versailles? No nation believed Berlin could bear such colossal sums in its exhausted economic state. Without a solution, the risk of crisis would erupt again, this time not just within Germany's borders, but across Europe. From this necessity, the international community turned to a solution, the Dawes Plan. This was not a forgiveness of Germany, but a restructuring to ensure the system could still function. A committee of experts, chaired by Charles G. Dawes, a banker and later U.S. vice president, was tasked with outlining the new mechanism. The plan, announced in 1924, was based on the principle that instead of demanding huge immediate payments from Germany, payments would be broken down, starting at a more manageable level and gradually increasing with its recovery capacity. Additionally, Germany would receive international loans, primarily from American banks, to restore its production and finance. A restructured, independent central banking system, the Reichsbank, was established to foster confidence that German currency would no longer be dominated by politics. The immediate impact of the Dawes Plan was a collective sigh of relief. Markets received it with renewed confidence. Investors returned to Berlin and foreign capital flowed in. Factories had funds to operate. International trade revived across Germany. After months of hyperinflation, the atmosphere gradually changed. Prices stabilized, wages regained meaning, and the middle class began to breathe again after the suffocation. But this plan was not just economically significant, it was also a political turning point. By accepting the Dawes Plan, Germany implicitly acknowledged international oversight. For many citizens, it was another humiliation. The country was controlled by foreign experts. Yet, for moderate leaders, this was the price of survival. Central bankers also viewed this plan as a lifeline for the entire system. Montagu Norman in London supported it, seeing it as the only way to ensure credit flows continued. Benjamin Strong in New York regarded it as an opportunity for the dollar and American financial markets to assert their central position. Émile Moreau in Paris was both in agreement and cautious. France wanted its reparations, but didn't want to become overly dependent on Washington's arrangements. Thanks to this plan, Germany emerged from the abyss of hyperinflation. Berlin returned to a vibrant city with theaters, cafes, and film studios, the image of a culture booming in the 1920s. But behind this picture lay a truth. The German economy still lived on short-term loans from the U.S. like a recovering patient. Berlin looked healthy, but was still on an IV drip. The Dawes Plan was a bridge that allowed Europe to move from chaos to a period of temporary stability. It proved that international coordination could prevent crises, and that flexibility could replace the absurd figures of Versailles. But at the same time, it sowed a new seed, an over-reliance on American credit, which would become its Achilles heel in the years to come. Temporarily, in the mid-1920s, Europe breathed a sigh of relief, but beneath that peaceful exterior, fragile financial currents were still swirling. After Germany found relief through the Dawes Plan, the focus shifted to London. Here, a symbolic yet highly controversial decision was about to be made: to return the pound sterling to the gold standard at its pre-war parity. Britain had been the heart of the global financial system before 1914. The pound sterling was the dominant currency, and the gold standard guaranteed that position. But the war had shattered everything. For 4 years, the government printed money and borrowed massively, and when peace returned, the pound no longer held its former value. To restore its central role, leaders believed there was only one path: to restore confidence by returning to the old parity, regardless of the cost. The man responsible for this decision was Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill. In 1925, he announced that the pound sterling would be repegged at its pre-1914 level, which was significantly higher than the post-war economy's real value. It was a move more political than economic. Churchill wanted to prove to the world that Britain remained invincible, that the empire still held its throne in trade and finance. But the price for this choice was too high. With the pound sterling overvalued, British exports immediately lost competitiveness. Goods from Manchester, Liverpool, or Glasgow became expensive in international markets. Industries, already weakened after the war, suffered another heavy blow. Unemployment spread, and the social atmosphere grew tense. Among economists, there was a vocal dissenter, John Maynard Keynes. He openly criticized this decision in his work, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill*, arguing that returning to the gold standard at the old parity was akin to shackling the economy to a broken iron frame. He called it a historical mistake that forced workers and businesses to pay the price for the government's grand illusion. Keynes not only saw immediate difficulties, but also warned of long-term consequences. The economy would be stifled, while rivals like the US and Germany gained an advantage. These criticisms made him a thorn in the side of conservatives, but also transformed him into a shining figure of new economic thinking. Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, was one of the strongest proponents of returning to the gold standard. For him, this was not just a financial issue, but an almost religious belief. Norman believed that only gold could guarantee order. His stubbornness, combined with Churchill's political pride, converged to create a fateful decision. When the pound sterling officially returned to the gold standard, London held solemn celebrations. The press wrote about the restoration of the empire's prestige. But internally, the labor market was shaken, factories closed, and a social storm quietly brewed. The gold standard, instead of being a life raft, became a millstone tied around the economy's neck. Britain, once the world's dominant financial center, now entered a decade of intense tension. The 1925 decision not only affected workers in industrial areas, but also created a global ripple effect. As the pound sterling was pushed higher, the trade balances of many other nations were also disrupted. The entire international system was once again shackled to an outdated mechanism. While the world sought to recover after the war, many nations tied themselves to dogmatic choices, relying more on honor and symbolism than on economic reality. If 1925 marked Britain's turning point with its decision to return to the gold standard, just 1 year later, Europe's gaze shifted to Paris. The franc fell freely, pushing the entire French economy to the brink of chaos. The press dubbed this period La Bataille du Franc * the Battle of the Franc. The reasons were clear. France was exhausted after the war. Its northern regions were devastated, production declined, and war debts mounted. Meanwhile, the government continuously overspent on reconstruction and maintaining its cumbersome administrative apparatus, leading to budget deficits. Market confidence wavered, investors began to flee, selling off francs to buy gold and foreign currency. The speed of depreciation caused social panic. In just a few months, the franc plummeted to one-third of the pound sterling's value. People rushed to hoard gold, saving in dollars or pounds instead of their domestic currency. Commercial banks were strained, foreign exchange reserves depleted. On the streets of Paris, fear was palpable in every daily transaction. Under this pressure, the government was forced to act. The first measure was to raise taxes and cut spending, demonstrating the state's readiness for austerity. Next, the Bank of France was given more power, sharply increasing interest rates to defend the franc. Simultaneously, a public relations campaign was launched. National leaders assured the populace that the franc would be protected at all costs. The core of this battle was confidence. Only when the people and the market believed the state was sufficiently determined would the franc have a chance to recover. Step by step, results began to appear. The rate of gold withdrawals decreased, exchange rates stabilized, and sporadic capital flows returned. But the social cost was significant. Austerity meant unemployment and reduced welfare. The working class and civil servants bore the brunt. Debates erupted everywhere. Supporters argued this was a necessary sacrifice to protect the nation. Opponents accused the government of sacrificing the lives of ordinary citizens to appease banks and foreign creditors. Behind the scenes, Moreau, governor of the Bank of France, played a central role. He trusted gold almost absolutely. For Moreau, defending the franc meant upholding honor and financial sovereignty. He was so unyielding that many colleagues considered him rigid. But this steadfastness became a pillar during the chaotic period. Ultimately, the Battle of the Franc ended with a temporary victory. The franc stabilized, its value stopped falling, and France escaped the abyss. On the surface, Paris seemed to have regained confidence, but just as in Berlin or London, this solution did not heal the root cause. The French economy remained weak, dependent on gold and international capital flows. Any shock could destabilize the system. After 1926, the French were temporarily reassured that they had protected their currency. But behind that picture, all of Europe was gradually becoming similar. Nations one by one returned to the gold standard, forcing their economies to live under rigid discipline. Despite unhealed wounds, the early winds signaling a storm had begun to blow, and they would not stop at France's borders. After France temporarily stabilized the franc in the 1926 battle, Europe seemed to have entered a period of peace. Berlin breathed thanks to the Dawes Plan. London was proud to have returned the pound sterling to the gold standard. Paris clung tightly to its gold reserves to protect the franc. But that clear sky did not last long. From 1926 to 1927, the first signs of new instability appeared: the early winds. The international credit market, revived by loans from the U.S., began to show its dark side. Capital flowed into Berlin at a dizzying pace, but it was largely short-term, easily withdrawn at the first sign of trouble. American investors were attracted by high yields in Europe, but this euphoria harbored great risks. Banks warned that the system was becoming overly dependent on Wall Street's generosity. In London, the difficulties caused by the overvalued pound sterling gradually became apparent. Exports continued to weaken, unemployment spread, and social pressure increased. Norman and Churchill remained resolute in their faith in the gold standard, seeing it as the foundation of national prestige. But in reality, the gold framework was becoming a burden, forcing the economy to sacrifice workers' interests to protect the exchange rate. In Paris, the franc had stopped falling, but only because France had adopted an extremely strict policy of austerity, high interest rates, and complete reliance on gold. The price of that stability was sluggish growth and constant political tension. In 1927, to ease the situation, a series of international meetings were held, most notably the Central Bankers' Conference in New York. Benjamin Strong, with his pragmatic mindset, sought to coordinate monetary policy among the major central banks. The goal was to de-escalate tensions, reduce pressure on the pound sterling and the franc, and prevent capital flight from Germany. The measure introduced was likened to a small gulp of whiskey. It wasn't a cure, just a temporary stimulant to calm the tremors. The Fed lowered interest rates, encouraging capital to flow out of the U.S., giving London and Paris more time. In the short term, this solution was effective. Markets calmed, currencies were bolstered, and confidence was maintained. But that's the nature of a gulp of whiskey. It provides short-term euphoria while the underlying disease remains untreated. The international financial system at this point was like a weakened body sustained by continuous stimulants. Each time signs of decline appeared, a makeshift solution was introduced, buying more time but not resolving the fundamental issues. The Rentenmark was stable in Germany, the pound sterling returned to the gold standard, the franc was held firm, and international capital flowed strongly. But beneath the surface, cracks were already visible. An excessive reliance on short-term credit from the US, the burden of the gold standard, and rising social discontent due to austerity policies. Sowing new winds, that's how this period is remembered. New winds of hope, of reconstruction efforts, but also winds carrying the seeds of a storm. Every measure, from the Dawes Plan to the return to the gold standard, from the Battle of the Franc to the small gulp of whiskey, had an immediate effect but also sowed paradoxes. The world's financial system was temporarily stable but not sustainable. People still believed that Europe had weathered the post-war chaos, but like the early winds, the signs of instability had only just begun to emerge. And when the true storm arrived, the world would no longer have time to build another bridge. Part 4, Reaping Another Whirlwind. The world seemed to be entering a new golden age. In New York, Wall Street became the grandest stage for faith and greed. In just a few years, stock prices soared, doubling and then tripling, and almost everyone, from industrialists to grocery clerks, believed they were living in an era of prosperity that could never end. But beneath that glittering facade, the undercurrents of the financial system were deforming. The supply of gold, the pillar of the entire monetary order, was no longer evenly distributed. Instead of flowing freely across centers, it accumulated in two places: the United States and France. These nations hoarded gold like treasure, while Britain and Germany gradually lost their reserves. This imbalance caused the gears of the system to gradually jam, even as the machine outwardly spun strongly. In Washington, the Federal Reserve under Benjamin Strong had once tried to regulate to maintain balance. But after his death in 1928, coordination weakened, and the Fed allowed domestic credit to swell, fueling the euphoria on Wall Street. In Paris, Émile Moreau continued his policy of gold accumulation, viewing it as a fortress to protect the franc. In London, Montagu Norman struggled to keep the pound sterling on the gold standard, even as reserves dwindled. In Berlin, Hjalmar Schacht witnessed the German economy living on short-term loans from the US, which could vanish overnight. In 1928, the American stock market became a magnet attracting all capital. Investors believed that stocks could only go up, and the banking system further encouraged this by offering margin loans. By putting down only a small fraction of real capital, people could borrow many times over to buy stocks. The more people borrowed, the higher prices climbed. The higher they climbed, the greater the confidence. A self-reinforcing spiral drove stock values far beyond the actual fundamentals of businesses. Complacency spread. Economists and journalists lauded this as proof of American capitalism's strength. Rare warnings were drowned out by cheers. People forgot that financial history always repeats cycles of euphoria followed by collapse. Meanwhile, the gold imbalance grew increasingly severe. The US and France held the majority of global reserves, while Britain and Germany were depleting theirs. This meant that when international credit was needed, London and Berlin no longer had the capacity to intervene. The system, once dependent on central bank coordination, was now fractured by self-interest. From Paris, Moreau was only concerned with strengthening the franc, unwilling to share gold. Washington's Fed was preoccupied with domestic needs, largely ignoring the outside world. Norman in London was like a captain trying to hold his ship together while the oars were broken. Seeing Berlin's increasing reliance on hot money from New York, Schacht understood it was a dangerous game. In 1929, the spiral tightened further. Stock prices reached unprecedented peaks, and short-term capital from the US flooded Europe, masking the underlying fragility. The entire system was like a machine hurtling straight into a storm, engines roaring, wheels spinning, but no one wanted to hit the brakes. The financial world entered a vortex. This was not just a metaphor, it was reality. It was sucked into a maelstrom fueled by greed and complacency, deepened by gold imbalance and a lack of central bank coordination. Blind faith in Wall Street's eternal prosperity reached its peak, and at that very moment, it began to crack. The isolated warnings that had echoed earlier were drowned out by cheers. Roger Babson, a financial analyst, had repeatedly warned that the market would collapse, but each time he spoke, stock prices continued to rise. Irving Fisher, a renowned professor at Yale, asserted that stocks had reached a permanently high plateau. This complacency was the veil obscuring the abyss. On October 24, 1929, later called Black Thursday, the veil fell. The New York stock market plunged into chaos. Shouts, frantic ringing bells, sell orders flooded the trading floor. 13 million shares were dumped in a single day, an unprecedented record. 4 days later, Black Tuesday dealt the fatal blow. 16 million shares changed hands, prices plummeted uncontrollably. Assets once thought solid evaporated in mere hours. The scene outside Broadway was no less chaotic. People who had believed themselves rich suddenly found themselves penniless. Banks were besieged by crowds trying to withdraw money. Stories of investors committing suicide, though later somewhat exaggerated, reflected widespread despair. Confidence, the most crucial capital of the financial system, collapsed along with stock prices. But what was remarkable was the initial reaction of the political and financial elite. Instead of recognizing this as the beginning of a comprehensive crisis, many believed it was merely a necessary adjustment, a purging of the rotten parts from the economy. Newspapers wrote that the collapse was an opportunity to eliminate reckless speculators and preserve businesses with solid foundations. President Hoover emphasized that the nation's fundamental economy remained sound. This perspective, while reassuring in the short term, concealed the true danger. The Wall Street crash not only wiped out individual investors' assets, but also crippled the banking and credit system, which had overlent to fuel the bubble. Now they bore colossal bad debts. When stocks crashed, collateralized loans turned into deadly burdens. A wave of bank failures began to spread, first among small banks, then gradually reaching larger institutions. In society, the impact was swift and severe. Workers lost jobs as businesses cut production. Farmers, already struggling with low agricultural prices, now lost access to credit. Industrial cities plunged into unemployment. Long lines of people waiting for charity began to appear. Yet in 1930, many still believed this was just a phase of adjustment. Editorials continued to emphasize that the fever had passed and markets would now stabilize. Some politicians viewed the crisis as a necessary fever to detoxify the economic body. But in reality, this detox was so potent that it killed even healthy parts. From Wall Street, the earthquake spread globally. Capital flows from the U.S., which had been sustaining Germany and many European countries, immediately contracted. Berlin, Paris, and London all felt the pressure. The international spiral, already evident from 1928-1929, now became an irresistible suction force. Purging the rotten parts, that phrase accurately reflected the mindset at the time. People wanted to believe this was a necessary step to eliminate excess, but the truth was that along with the rotten parts, the entire system was being dragged into the abyss. In 1930, the world still tried to believe that the Wall Street crash was just a temporary accident. But in reality, the global economy had entered a period of deep paralysis. Industrial production plummeted uncontrollably. In the U.S. alone, industrial output fell by almost 1/3 in just 1 year. In Germany, factories closed en masse, and unemployment exploded. In Britain, heavy industry, already weakened, became even more dilapidated. Commodity prices plunged. Wheat, cotton, rubber goods that had sustained millions of farmers worldwide now fetched only half or 1/3 their value. For nations dependent on agricultural exports, this was a deadly blow. Farmers fell into despair, unable to sell their produce or repay bank loans. The spiral of bankruptcies spread from rural areas to cities. John Maynard Keynes described this situation with a haunting image. The world economy was like a car that had stalled due to a faulty magneto. The engine was still there, the wheels intact, but the ignition system, the spark that started the whole system, was broken. Credit, the electrical current feeding the machine, no longer flowed. Everything stood still in a strange paralysis. The core of the stagnation lay in gold. Instead of circulating among centers to balance the system, gold continued to flow primarily into two places, the U.S. and France. By 1931, these two nations held nearly 60% of global gold reserves. The rest of the world, especially Britain and Germany, were increasingly depleted. In London, Montagu Norman tried to keep the pound sterling within the gold standard framework, but reserves were continuously drawn out to meet international payment demands. In Berlin, Hjalmar Schacht and the German government struggled with the gold outflow, while short-term loans from the US began to be withdrawn. The system, once dependent on circulation, was now like a body with blocked arteries. The vicious cycle tightened. Low commodity prices led to reduced export revenues. Reduced revenues meant inability to repay debts. Failure to repay debts caused investor confidence to vanish. Capital was withdrawn, gold flowed out, and without gold, maintaining the gold standard became impossible, leading to currency crises. In Paris, Émile Moreau and the Bank of France steadfastly held onto gold, viewing it as an inviolable foundation. But this very accumulation destabilized the system further. Gold was drawn to Paris, while Berlin and London were starved of it. Instead of sharing, each nation clung to its own interests. International coordination was virtually paralyzed. In this context, millions fell into unemployment. In the US, the number of unemployed reached 8 million by 1931. In Germany, the figure was even more horrifying, accounting for 20% of the labor force. Despair turned into anger, and anger turned into political instability. Extremist movements, once marginal echoes, now began to capture public attention. The faulty magneto was not just a technical image. It reflected the truth that the entire global economic system, though outwardly intact, had ceased to function. The wheels were there, the engine was there, but the current credit and confidence had been cut off. As 1931 began, people understood that the problem was no longer just a Wall Street crash or a few bank failures. This was a global economic catastrophe, and it was rolling in like a tsunami, ready to shatter any remaining defenses. The crisis shifted from paralysis to open panic. The first epicenter to erupt was Germany, where the banking system, which had lived on short-term US credit, was now exposed in its fragility. From the beginning of the year, a fierce wave of capital withdrawals occurred. American banks, under domestic pressure, began recalling short-term loans from Berlin. The capital flows that had nourished the German economy throughout the 1920s suddenly vanished. Foreign exchange reserves ran dry. German banks, already strained, stood on the brink. The climax was the collapse of Danske Bank in July 1931. This was one of Germany's largest banks, but the massive run by depositors paralyzed it. When the bank's doors slammed shut, faith in the entire system evaporated. A full-blown banking crisis erupted, spreading to major cities. People rushed to withdraw money, hoarding gold and foreign currency. The government was forced to close banks for several days to prevent a chain collapse. The Danske Bank event was like a cannonball hitting an already listing ship. And that cannonball didn't just cause a fire in Germany. Immediately, Europe reeled. Banks in Austria, already weak, also collapsed. In Britain, financial markets suffered a severe shock as international credit lost confidence. Gold reserves, already thin, were being drawn down daily. Simultaneously, domestic political pressure in Germany reached its peak. Unemployment surpassed 4 million people, about a quarter of the workforce. The populace, desperate and furious with the Weimar government, viewed them as helpless and weak. Extremist movements, especially the Nazis, exploited this opportunity to expand their influence. The 1931 banking crisis transformed anger into real political power. In London, Montagu Norman faced a situation like a ship in a stormy sea. To keep the pound sterling on the gold standard, the Bank of England had to continuously sell gold, but the outflow was too strong, reserves plummeted, and confidence wavered in emergency meetings. The atmosphere was so tense that fierce arguments often broke out between officials and financiers. The phrase, "a loose cannon on the deck of the world," became the most accurate image for 1931. That cannon was Germany, but it was also the entire system. As the world ship swayed in the economic storm, the unsecured cannon careened wildly, causing further havoc. Each collision was a bank collapse, each explosion a nation falling deeper into crisis. The storm was no longer confined to Europe. It spread to the colonies, to economies dependent on raw material exports. The prices of Brazilian coffee, Indochinese rubber, and Indian cotton continued their free fall. colonial governments lost revenue, and the lives of the populace became miserable. The economic crisis transformed into a global social crisis. After the shockwaves from Berlin and Vienna in 1931, the focus shifted to London. Britain, once the world's dominant financial center, was now pushed into a life-or-death situation. The pound sterling was still tied to the gold standard, but reserves were depleted after months of defensive efforts. International capital fled, gold was withdrawn from the Bank of England, ton by ton. The noose tightened daily. Norman, who had been the most loyal devotee of the gold standard, now found himself in a desperate situation. He believed that abandoning gold meant losing order, losing the empire's honor, but reality no longer allowed that belief to persist. In September 1931, after many tense meetings and under irresistible pressure, the British government announced the suspension of the pound sterling's convertibility to gold. This was a global shock. The pound, once considered a pillar of the international system, was no longer backed by gold. Other countries followed suit. Japan and a host of colonies quickly abandoned gold to preserve their reserves. Only a few nations clung on, most notably the US and France. But the whole world now knew that the golden shackles were broken. The immediate impact, surprisingly, was contrary to fears. When the pound left gold, the currency immediately depreciated, making British exports cheaper on international markets. Industry breathed a sigh of relief, unemployment eased. The government gained more room to loosen policy, inject credit, and restart production. Instead of collapsing, the British economy began to recover, a paradox exposing the absurd rigidity of the gold standard. But internationally, this shock pushed the system into fragmentation. There was no longer a common standard. Each nation acted independently. Some devalued, others erected tariff barriers. Each tried to protect itself by sacrificing global trade. The world plunged into a spiral of fragmentation instead of a central order. In Paris, Émile Moreau and the Bank of France held firm with gold, seeing it as the last bastion. French gold reserves continued to swell, but the price was a stifled economy. The franc was overvalued, French goods lost competitiveness, and the economy grew gloomier. Only when forced to abandon gold did France find a path to recovery. But by then it was too late, and the country soon fell into the spiral of war. Later research showed a clear pattern. Nations that left gold early recovered quickly, while those that clung on longer sank deeper into crisis. That lesson became a vivid proof of Keynes's argument. A modern economy needs flexibility. Policy cannot be frozen by a medal. The phrase, "the caravan moved on," reflected the spirit of this period. History did not stop with the collapse of the gold standard. Instead, nations continued their journey, each taking a different path, only to converge in a new world shaped by war and reconstruction. The decade of 1933–1944 was a period both painful and creative. Painful due to the disintegration of the old order, leading to shrinking international trade, escalating political conflicts, and ultimately, the tragedy of World War II. Creative because many governments, for the first time, actively used fiscal and monetary policies as crisis-fighting tools. From this, the concept of macroeconomic management truly emerged. After the caravan abandoned the barren sands of the gold standard, they traveled through rugged, dangerous paths, but at least these paths offered a chance for survival. The lesson learned was clear. Rigid monetary order cannot guarantee stability. Only flexibility and international cooperation can prevent disaster from recurring. Looking back from the late 1930s, it's clear that the period from 1914 to 1944 was a closed loop, starting with war, passing through monetary experiments and crises, and ending in an even more ferocious war. And in that spiral, the four central figures, the Lords of Finance, left a profound mark. Montagu Norman in London, who blindly trusted the gold standard, became a symbol of stubbornness. For him, gold was not just a financial mechanism but an almost religious belief. But it was this very belief that trapped Britain, stifling production and employment and pushing society to the brink of tension. Hjalmar Schacht in Berlin, with his resourcefulness and thirst for power, was the architect of Germany's economic recovery efforts after hyperinflation. He helped the economy escape chaos, but also paved the way for a totalitarian regime to use monetary policy as a tool for political and wartime objectives. Émile Moreau in Paris, with his obsession with gold, accumulated colossal reserves, but allowed the French economy to be suffocated. He was proof of the paradox. One could hold a treasure chest yet grow poorer by not knowing how to use it. Benjamin Strong in New York, who perhaps saw farthest, recognized the need for international cooperation. But his early death in 1928 left a void no one could fill. Lacking a coordinating leader, the world's financial systems spiraled downward even faster. Their story shows that an increasingly interconnected world cannot function if central banks act as isolated fortresses. The lack of coordination transformed local shocks into global crises. The gold standard, presumed to guarantee stability, instead became a burden dragging the entire system down. The biggest lesson learned is that currency cannot be bound to an inert metal, while economies and societies are constantly evolving. True stability does not come from preserving currency value at all costs, but from adaptability from policy serving people, not the other way around. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, a new order was established. It still relied on gold, but in a different role, as a standard for the dollar, rather than binding all nations. And for the first time, an international institution, the International Monetary Fund, was created to coordinate, instead of leaving each nation to fend for itself. This was the result of 3 decades of blood and chaos, the legacy of a period where the arrogance and dogma of the lords of finance made the entire world pay the price. As this story concludes, what echoes is not the glory of gold or the power of bankers, but a reminder: financial crises are never just about numbers. They touch the lives of millions, shattering trust, undermining social foundations, and paving the way for terrible political upheavals. Understanding this is the only way to prevent history from repeating itself. When financial power is not coupled with responsibility, the world must bear the consequences. And from those ashes, a new generation was forced to build a different order, more flexible, more equitable, and hopefully more humane. As this book closes, we see humanity's long journey from blind faith in gold to a maelstrom of crisis, and then the birth of a new order. This is not just the history of banks and markets, but the history of people workers losing jobs, families breaking apart, and entire societies pushed into the abyss by decisions that seemed purely technical.